series on the case called Candy, and it is insane. But before we get into it, I just want to quickly mention that I do have a Patreon, and we are in the middle of Cruel Summer, which is like a series I'm doing the entire month of June, where I am releasing a new true crime video every other day, the entire month. So that's 15 new true crime videos this month. Plus, you will have access to all of the previous true crime videos on Patreon over the last 2.5 years. So there's lots of content over there for you. It's only $5 a month. So check out the link down below and join us for Cruel Summer. Okay. I have tons of notes on this case, so I think it's gonna be a super long one, but let's get into it. Betty Eileen Pomeroy was born January 9th, 1950, to Bob and Bertha Pomeroy. She was the first of 3 children born to the couple, who would go on to have 2 sons, Ron and Richard. Betty was born and raised in the small town of Harper, Kansas, and her early years were pretty much what you would expect of a child raised in a working class family in small town middle America in the 50s. Bob Pomeroy was a traveling insurance salesman, and Bertha was a stay-at-home mom. The Pomeroys also owned a restaurant that was called Bert and Bob's Cafe, and they owned a gas station as well as a business office. Betty was described as a very warm person even as a child. She had this very bubbly personality, and she was very motivated. She had dreams of leaving her small town and living in the big city. Kansas, and soon after they were married, he accepted a job as a defense contractor at Rockwell International, which was located in Texas. So Alan and Betty moved to Dallas for Alan's new job. This was such an exciting time for the new couple. They were in love, they had their whole lives ahead of them, and finally, at least for Betty, she was getting out of the small town, going into the exciting new city of Dallas. Now, people did begin to notice Betty's personality change once she married Alan. She became very dependent on him, not just like financially, but like emotionally. In 1975, Betty gave birth to a little girl named Elisa. Betty and Alan knew they wanted to expand their family. They were going to be having more children, so they decided to move to a larger home where they had more room to grow. So they bought a home in Wiley, Texas, which was about a half hour from Dallas. Wiley was this small, sleepy town of about 3,000 people, and it consisted mostly of farms. It was very quiet, very safe, the perfect place to put down roots for the young family. They bought their home for $70,000, and it was right in the middle of the town of Wiley at 410 Dogwood Drive, and this was a little 3-bedroom ranch-style home. After the move, Betty got a job teaching 5th grade, and they really settled into Wiley. They loved the slower pace of the town after having lived in the big city, and they loved the people they met as well. Wiley quickly felt like home to the family, and they became close with their neighbors. They made a lot of new friends at their church as they became more and more involved in the church. And the church was located in Lucas, Texas, which was about 15 minutes away. And the church they attended was the First United Methodist Church. So they made a lot of friends at the church, and even Elisa made some little friends at the Sunday school at the church. And one of the families that they quickly befriended was the Montgomery family. Candace, or Candy Montgomery as everyone called her, would become one of Betty's closest friends. Candy was very popular within the church community. Everyone knew her. She was super outgoing. She was in the church choir. She helped organize different activities. side, so the church was like right in the middle. And the town that the Montgomerys lived in was just starting to be discovered by these very wealthy executives who were wanting to raise their families outside of the booming city of Dallas. So, Candy and Pat had a daughter the same age as Elisa, and their daughter's name was Jenny. So Jenny and Elisa became really good friends. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about Candy Montgomery for a minute. While she was this super involved, very devout Methodist woman, she was actually pretty rebellious, but she kept that rebellious side kind of more hidden from those around her. Candy was born into an army family, so she grew up moving around a lot. There was a lot of excitement. She'd seen a lot. She'd lived in different cities and different places, and she really craved the excitement of this lifestyle, the newness of it all. So, as a child, Candy knew what she wanted and wouldn't stop until she got it. She left home after high school and she really never looked back. She craved new experiences and excitement, and she enjoyed being the center of attention and getting a lot of attention from men as well. She was beautiful. She was a very petite woman, and she had this blonde hair, and she dated around a lot, and reportedly even kind of was sleeping with a lot of the men she dated, which wasn't happening as much in the 50s as like it is now, if that makes sense. But she never got too serious with any of the men. She wanted to keep her options open, and she knew that she wanted to marry someone with money. She wanted a comfortable, cushy life. And when Pat Montgomery came along, Candy knew he was the one. He was an electrical engineer for Texas Instruments, and they married in the early 1970s. Candy loved Paul, but she wasn't ever quiet about the fact that she had married for money. At the time she married Pat, he was making $70,000 a year, which would be the equivalent to about $530,000 a year in like today's salary. Alan wasn't the best looking guy, but he wasn't unattractive either. He was just like an average guy. He was very reserved, very quiet, very introverted, which was kind of the exact opposite of Candy. So, once Candy married Alan, she stopped working. She didn't need to work anymore. And soon she gave birth to a little girl who they was around the time that Bethany was born that Betty really began to struggle, and Betty and Alan started to have some problems in their marriage. Betty had suffered pretty severe post-traumatic or postpartum depression, and she had like some chronic pain issues. She began to turn more and more inward. There wasn't very much known about postpartum depression in the early 70s. Mostly doctors would just give her Valium and kind of send her on her way. But she became more and more like introverted to the point where she wasn't socializing with friends. She was barely even talking to her husband. And she had been working as a teacher, but her students were what she described as unruly, and she no longer enjoyed teaching. It was almost as if there was no joy or purpose left for Betty. So she had all of these personal things going on, but like I said, her marriage was on the rocks as well. Alan and Betty had a hard time communicating with each other, and their physical relationship was basically non-existent. Betty was terrified of abandonment. She worried all the time that Alan was going to leave her, and so she became more and more clingy, and she just wasn't in a good place, and their marriage wasn't either, and so she and Alan ended up attending a marriage workshop retreat through their church that was called the Methodist Marriage Encounter. And this retreat promised to make marriages thrive by rekindling the romance. So Alan and Betty headed off to the weekend retreat while Candy offered to keep the kids for the weekend. I guess part of this retreat was that the couples couldn't leave each other's side. So it's a very intense weekend where the couples were expected to bond without any kind of distractions like TV or anything like that. Now, Alan at this point was traveling a lot for work, and during this retreat, it came out that this made Betty feel very anxious and very disconnected from Alan. So while they were on this retreat, they decided that when Alan traveled, he would be in constant communication with Betty. He would call and check in several times throughout the day, kind of to ease her fears. So during this retreat, there were different workshops available, and one of them encouraged Betty and Alan to write letters to each other. And in one of these letters that Betty wrote to Alan, she said, quote, "Here I sit crying because I am so happy and so proud to be your wife. I've known that all along, but when you stop to really think about it, we are so lucky to have each other. Let's not let anything come between us." End quote. So, this marriage retreat really did seem to help actually gotten a new job he was excited about, although he was traveling much more, and that was hard on Betty. On June 13th, 1980, Alan was headed out of town for yet another business trip in St. Paul, Minnesota. He left home in the morning. He headed to Dallas, where he had to grab a few things from his office, and then he headed off to the airport. Now remember, when he traveled, Betty was very anxious, and so he was making a point to call and check in very frequently with Betty. So he called from the airport, but Betty didn't answer, which was strange because she was so anxious to get these calls that she usually almost like sat around and waited for them. But they did have 2 children, so he figured she just got tied up with something. He got on his flight, which was over 2.5 hours, and when he got off the plane, he went to his hotel and checked in, and then called Betty again. But again, she didn't answer the phone. Betty had been so insistent that he call her regularly that it made no sense that she wasn't answering the phone, and Pat became concerned. So he picked up the phone and called Richard Parker, who was a next-door neighbor, and asked if Richard would go check on Betty. On Friday, June 13th, 1980, Richard, along with 2 other neighbors, Lester Gaylor and Jerry McMahon, headed over to the Gore home. It was nighttime by this point, and the home was dark. Not a single light was visible from outside. So at first, it seemed as if Betty and the children weren't even home, given how dark the house was. But as the men neared the front door, they could hear 11-year-old Bethany screaming. They entered the home and followed the sounds of the screaming baby, and they found Bethany in her crib. She was screaming. She was soaked from a diaper that hadn't been changed in hours. One of the wives of the men took the baby to her home to change her and feed her. Bethany seemed under duress. She was starving. She had obviously been screaming for a long time, but other than that, she was physically okay. The men at this point are super alarmed by the situation, and they slowly began to make their way through the home. They became alarmed when they saw what seemed like blood droplets on several of the doorknobs in the home. The only light that was on in the house was this faint light shining from under the door of this utility / laundry room in the back of the house. So, this was just a small room. There was a washer and dryer in there, like a freezer, and a little storage cabinet. Lester Gaylor slowly opened the door to the room to what he described as a scene from a horror movie. Inside the room, the men found Betty Gore lying face up in a pool of blood that was 1 inch thick. The men initially, believed that she had shot herself in the head because of all the blood and damage done to her head. Likely because of that, and also because what had actually happened to Betty was, not even fathomable to these men. 30-year-old Betty Gore had actually been struck 41 times with an axe. 28 of these blows were to her head, and the coroner would later determine that Betty had been continually struck in the head over and over again, even after she was dead. Police would find these, indentations on the floor from the axe missing the target and hitting the floor. There were also marks on the ceiling from the axe, when you pull back to hit someone, it would hit the ceiling with such force that it made indentations as well. Richard Parker immediately ran out of the room, ran to the phone, and called the police. Just minutes after the police arrived, Alan Gore called home looking for news. He's in Minnesota, and he's kind of freaking out that no one is getting back to him. When he called his home, a police officer answered, and he was told that his wife had been brutally murdered, and then they asked him to account for his whereabouts. Alan told the officer over the phone that he was in St. Paul, that he had left that morning, and he said he hadn't been able to get a hold of Betty all day. He was worried because she freaked out when he traveled, and she always wanted him to call and check in, but she wasn't answering, so he called his neighbors to see if they would check in on her. So once Alan heard this horrific news, he rushed to the airport to try and catch a flight back to Dallas, and he was able to get home late that night, the same night. Alan had been completely distraught, and he was also worried sick about his daughters. Bethany had been in the home when his wife had been brutally attacked and killed, but police had told him that she was safe. He was a little relieved to know that Elisa was safely spending the night with the Montgomery family, so she hadn't been home when this attack had occurred. Now, once Alan arrived to his home, police took note at how calm and even killed he seemed, which was strange to them, but he was very cooperative with police. The entire home became the murder scene, and police quickly got to work trying to recollection of a very personal attack. And also, I guess, the fact that most of the blows were directed toward her head and face indicates that it was personal and there was a lot of rage. The murder scene didn't really give police a lot of clues as to what had taken place inside the Gore home on that hot summer day. Now, they did have the murder weapon, which was an axe that had been left just right next to Betty's body. The axe, as it would turn out, belonged to the Gores. They kept it in the utility closet. So, I guess the killer didn't think to take it with them. Now, this was the 80s. There was no DNA testing, even fingerprint. The way that they did their fingerprint comparisons was not super exact. So, I guess the killer didn't think that the murder weapon could ever lead back to them. There were no cell phones. They couldn't follow cell phone pings. There wasn't CCTV footage. All the neighbors didn't have rings. There was no social media, so police began investigating, but it was a lot of footwork on their end. Now, police did find a bloody fingerprint on the freezer in the utility closet, but they didn't have the technology back then to lift the fingerprint, so they took a picture, hoping that they would be able to compare it to any suspects they might find. Police also determined that after killing Betty, the killer had tried to clean up the blood, but didn't make much progress. There was so much blood that they stopped pretty early on in this cleanup. Maybe the killer was scared away, scared they were gonna get caught. Or maybe they just realized it was too big of a job. But for whatever reason, the killer did stop. Police also found a bloody footprint, so they were able to determine that the shoe impression came from a flip-flop. And it was a men's size 3 or a women's size 5 flip-flop. And this is pretty significant because they were believing that their killer had to have been a man, just because of the force and the strength it would take to axe somebody like this. But finding such a small shoe print was kind of making them rethink that theory. There was also blood found in the shower and hair in the drain, so this suggested that the killer had taken a shower and cleaned up after the murder, which would make sense because the killer had to have been covered in blood. Maybe most haunting of all, beside the fact that Betty Gore was killed on Friday, the 13th of June, was the fact that police found a drop of blood on this newspaper that was sitting open on the table. And the newspaper was open to the movie showing times of The Shining. The Shining had been released just 3 weeks prior to the murder, and this movie was also about a brutal axe murder. So the crime scene is investigated, evidence was collected, investigating the murder, and he started questioning everyone who was close to Betty, as well as canvassing the neighborhood, speaking to neighbors, hoping someone saw or heard something that would help them. Of course, Alan was their first suspect. So I guess because of the burnt coffee, they had a timeline that she was murdered early in the morning. So even though he said he had flown to St. Paul, they believed he could have still been their killer. He killed her and then flew to St. Paul, kind of establishing an alibi, knowing she wouldn't be found until he sent someone there to find her. So, it was very convenient that he was out of town or on his way out of town. But Alan was questioned by police, and he admitted that he and Betty had gotten into a pretty big argument that morning before he left, but he swore he had nothing to do with her murder. He voluntarily took a polygraph, which he passed. In the meantime, tips came in. I guess there were like a few false confessions. People were calling, like a prank calling the Gore home. Tips came in from fellow church members saying there was like a suspicious car at the church. Just everyone kind of wanted to insert themselves into this investigation and help, but it ended up with just some pretty false tips. But then police would get a tip from a 5-year-old child that would break the case wide open and lead to some pretty shocking discoveries. So this little girl lived next to the Gores, and she told her parents that she had been playing outside on the morning of June 13th, which they knew she had. But she had happened to see someone leaving the Gore home, and she actually happened to see someone leaving the Gore home not long after she herself had gone to the front door and knocked, hoping that Elisa was home and could play with her, but no one answered the door, so she remembered thinking it was weird that someone left, because she knew that that person had to have been inside the home when she had knocked. Anyway, this little girl told police that she watched Candy Montgomery walk out of the Gore home around 11 a.m. This was the first good lead that police had, so they decided to ask Candy to come in and answer a few questions, hoping she may have more information as to what happened to Betty. Maybe she knew of something Betty was going through, an argument she had had with someone. They just were thinking Candy may have some information because she was such good friends with Betty. So Candy told police that on the morning Betty was killed, she had gone to First Methodist Church. There was this summer Bible camp where she had dropped her kids off at. Then she left to run an errand. Now they were planning on having Elisa Gore spend the night. They were gonna go see a new movie and she was gonna sleep over. But she'd forgotten her swimming suit, and so she ran to the Gore home to grab that. And she said while she was there, she went into the laundry room to get the bathing suit. She used the restroom, fixed her hair a little bit, and then she left. She said she went back to the church to pick up her 2 children, plus Elisa Gore, police discovered a possible motive for the murder, and a secret so shocking the entire town was like blown away. The day after Candy was questioned by police, Alan Gore called the police station and told a detective that there was something he needed to get off his chest. He had been having an affair with a woman that he knew from church, a woman who was very close to his family, and this woman was Candy Montgomery. Candy had grown tired of her boring life in the quiet Texas town, and she'd been looking for anything to spice up her life, and I guess an affair seemed like something fun. She had been playing volleyball through their church, and Alan also played on the volleyball team, and obviously she had known who he was for a very long time, but she'd never really thought of him romantically until she decided she wanted to have an affair and started looking around. She flirted with him for a few weeks. She reportedly loved the way that Alan smelled. So according to Alan, she came up to him one night in the church parking lot after a volleyball game and just straight up proposed that they have an affair. She told him that her marriage was boring and that her husband wasn't much to look at. She also told Alan that she had married Pat for money and that she had never experienced transcendent sex with him. She told him, quote, "I want fireworks," end quote. She said outright that she wanted a very, no strings attached affair, no feelings, no I love yous, just sex. Alan was stunned by this proposal, but very quickly he agreed he was flattered by this. But before they began the affair, they sat down and made a pros and cons list, and it was very well thought out. They also made certain rules that they had to abide by, and the rules were that they would split the cost right down the middle. They would split the cost of hotel rooms. They would only meet on weekdays, and they would not become emotionally invested in each other. This had to be purely physical. So they began this torrid love affair, meeting up during the day when Betty was teaching and Pat was at work. They would always meet at the Como Motel in Richardson, Texas. And I guess Candy was very passionate about these hookups with Alan. She began to feel more alive than she had in months, and she just seemed happier. She would make him lunch and bring it, and she just was really excited about it. She even confided in a few friends that she was having an affair, although she never used anyone's names. According to the Texas Monthly, even in the thick of this affair with Alan, she continued her friendship with Betty. She even threw her a surprise baby shower while she was pregnant with Bethany. And then things kind of fizzled out, and as it had been in the beginning. And so she I guess reportedly wanted to find another lover and start it all over again. She was chasing that high. So once police find out about this affair, they have motive, and they begin to suspect that Candy and Alan had planned to kill Betty to get her out of the way. And they think that Alan went to St. Paul while Candy killed her so they could be together, and he had an alibi. This quiet church community erupted in rumors and speculation upon hearing the news of Candy and Alan's affair. When Betty had been killed, Candy had been there. She had grieved with the family. She had brought in food for the family. And it was just shocking that she had been sleeping with, like, her best friend's husband. A woman named Nancy Crandell, who was friends with Betty and Candy, told police that she had actually seen Candy shortly after the murders had taken place because their kids had gone to this, like, Bible summer camp thing together. So she had saw Candy that morning when she had dropped her children off, and she also saw Candy that afternoon when she went back to pick up her children. Nancy noticed that Candy had changed her clothing. So police find this out, and they ask Candy to come back in for questioning, and this was on June 17th. So this is all happening within a couple days of Betty's murder. She spoke to police again willingly. She stuck to the same story she had given them before. She was fingerprinted, and during this questioning, they did her fingerprints and then took it to compare it to the bloody fingerprint, and I guess it was a match. I don't know how accurate comparing fingerprints to a picture of a fingerprint was, but according to them, it was a match. Police then asked if Candy would submit to a polygraph test, and she declined. But they did learn that Candy wore a size 5 shoe, the same shoe size as the bloody flip-flop print that had been left at the murder scene. Candy Montgomery was arrested for murder on June 26th, 1980. Once arrested, Candy was strip searched and her body was photographed, and police discovered multiple cuts and bruises on her body, including a pretty deep cut on her toe, which I guess she needed medical attention for, but she had not sought out medical attention. So they transported her to the hospital to have this toe looked at, and they're thinking this is super suspicious. If you get hurt, if you cut your toe and it needs to be treated, why wouldn't you go have that treated? When they arrived at the hospital, they asked her to sign her consent to be treated, and she refused. But one of the police officers signed the paperwork, and the exam and the treatment happened anyway. Officers took more photos during the exam. They were very interested in this toe because a killer is wearing flip-flops, swinging an axe around, and we know that she missed several times because there were all of these indentations on the reasoning police gave was that she was going to be handed over to a respected bonding company in Dallas County who was more equipped to deal with crimes of this magnitude. Eventually, she was bonded out the next day, and it was a $100,000 bond. Candy and Pat had already hired a defense team by the time she got out of jail. One of her lawyers was actually a friend of theirs that they knew from church named Donald Crowder. And the other was a well-respected defense attorney named Robert Udishin. The day after Candy was arrested and bailed out, Candy and Pat went to church. Her attorney, Donald, would later say of this Sunday service, quote, "Almost everyone in church went up and hugged her and told her they believed she couldn't have done this," end quote. Also, the First Methodist pastor said, quote, that she would be guilty of what they say is incomprehensible. She's not capable of committing murder. She is very creative, very talented, a highly intelligent person, end quote. So, more people came forward from the church community to describe Candy to the media, and they said she was a pillar of the community. She was everyone's best friend, and that no one believed that she could have done this. Our lawyers released a statement saying that they believe a man committed this murder. In part, this statement said, quote, "We would hope that they would come to their senses and look for the real murderer," end quote. So, everyone very eagerly awaited the trial of Candy Montgomery to begin, and everyone believed she was innocent. So, it was shocking when the trial did begin in October of 1980, and the defense claimed that Candy did in fact kill Betty Gore in self-defense. So, the affair between Candy and Alan was really harped upon during the entire trial because the prosecution used this as a motive. They said Candy was jealous of Betty because Alan had ended the affair. Don was questioned about the affair, and he said that it was nothing more than two intelligent people who had made a mistake. Candy told the court that the affair was completely over. It had stopped months before the murder. She didn't miss him. She didn't think about him like she had wanted to end it. And she didn't even know that Betty knew about the affair until that morning when she stopped by the Gore home to pick up a bathing suit for Elisa. And this was when Betty confronted her. She said that she had gotten into an argument with Alan that morning before he left for St. Paul, and it was about the affair, and Betty was mad, and she kind of sat at home and stewed about it. So by the time that Candy arrived, Betty was like enraged, and Candy did her near the laundry room, but Betty blocked the way. She said that Betty picked up the axe and swung it at her, but missed, and it landed on the linoleum floor right by her foot, and it kind of bounced off the linoleum and cut Candy's toe. And at this point, Candy began begging Betty to stop, saying, "Please don't, please don't." And she said Betty looked at her and said, "Shh," like she was shushing her so she wouldn't wake up the baby. The two began to struggle, and Candy was able to get the axe away from Betty. And she said at this point, rage just took over, and she kind of blacked out, and she said she couldn't see what she was doing to Betty. So she admits to the murder, but the question that the jury had to decide was, did Candace Montgomery kill Betty Gore intentionally? Did she go to the Gore house that morning intending to kill Betty? Or was this self-defense? The fact that Candy went in flip-flops and she didn't bring a murder weapon, like the murder weapon was in the home, suggests she hadn't gone there with the intent to kill Betty. But the prosecution argued that the brutality of the crime grossly overstates self-defense. According to them, she could have struck Betty with the axe once or twice in self-defense and then escaped the home. But 41 strikes with an axe doesn't exactly scream self-defense. The defense then kind of tries to counter this by telling the jury about a very traumatic childhood accident Betty was involved in which she had been struck with a sharp object and she was bleeding profusely, and she was hurt, but she was also scared. And she was crying, and her mother turned to her and shushed her. So, remember in Candy's statement, Betty had shushed her. So, the defense said that as Candy is begging for her life and Betty shushes her, this caused a dissociative reaction from past trauma, and she went into this almost fugue state where she couldn't even remember what was happening and she just flipped out. But then Candy said, quote, I hit her, and I hit her. She fell slowly, almost to a sitting position. I kept hitting her and hitting her. I felt so guilty, so dirty, and so ashamed, end quote. So this statement from Candy kind of suggests she wasn't in a blackout fugue state because she obviously remembered exactly what happened during the attack. Anyway, the defense also really attacked the police work in this case. They said that Candy's civil rights had been violated when she was denied bail. They also said that strip searching and photographing her was illegal and inappropriate. The prosecution tried to counter these claims by saying that Betty didn't have any defense wounds. She didn't even appear to have had time to try to escape the attacks. Remember, Candy had said that they had struggled for the axe, but Betty didn't have a cut, a bruise, nothing. So it seemed like she had been attacked. she was not suspecting it, and she didn't have the time to fight back. The prosecution argued this was a crime of opportunity. One of the women had confronted the other about the affair, and Candy had followed Betty into the laundry room where she saw the axe, grabbed it, and began hitting her with it. It took the jury just 4 hours of deliberation before they came back with a not guilty verdict. And the courtroom erupted when this verdict was read. Betty's friends and family were completely outraged. Her brother Richard would later say that knowing the way his sister had been killed, how brutal it was hard enough. But then knowing that someone she knew had done it to her, someone she loved and trusted, just knowing that was excruciating. The family did not believe justice was served. They believed Candy had killed her in cold blood. Okay, let's talk about the aftermath now. Alan's actions after the murder trial wrapped up are super suspicious to me, but you tell me what you think. Alan went on to meet a woman named Eileen, who he married just 3 months after the trial. They moved away from Wiley to get a fresh start, but they did not take his children with them because he actually handed custody over to his in-laws, to Betty's parents, Bob and Bertha, and he signed away his rights as a parent, and the children were taken back to Kansas, and they were raised in the same small town that Betty had been. So he marries this woman 3 months after his wife is brutally murdered. They moved away, but later divorced, and he married a woman named Lindy, and they are still married and live in Maine together. Does anyone else think that him not only getting remarried that quickly, but also kind of leaving his kids is weird? I mean, the evidence suggests that Candy was the killer, but do you guys think that Alan was involved in, the planning of it? I don't know. Let me know. So Elisa now goes by Lisa, and she's married and has 2 children, and she still lives in Kansas, and Bethany is married and lives in Las Vegas with her 3 children. They both changed their last names, obviously, and they both grew up and followed in their mother's footsteps and became teachers, which I think is so sweet. After her acquittal, Candy told the media that she wanted to move on and return to life as normal. The Montgomery family left Texas and moved to Atlanta, where Candy became a certified family counselor. Pat and Candy eventually divorced, and after the divorce, Candy dropped her married name and went back to her maiden name of Wheeler, so Candace Wheeler. She is still practicing as a family therapist in Dawsonville, Georgia. Today, she's still a counselor. And that is the murder of Betty Gore. Kind of an insane case. I definitely want you guys to let me know what you think. I love to hear your theories, and also comments help with the algorithm so much. So leave a comment. I'm going to quickly cite my sources for this video. I got information from an episode of the show Snapped, season 30, episode 13, titled The Murder of Betty Gore. So Moxie.com had an article titled The Murder of Betty Gore at the Hands of a Desperate Housewife, Candy Montgomery by Kim Bryan. TheGrunch.com had an article titled Love and Death, the True Story Behind the Murder of Betty Gore by Paris L. And the Texas Monthly had a series of articles by Jim Atkinson and John Bloom titled Love and Death in Silicon Prairie. Thank you guys so much for joining me for another video. Please check out my Patreon. That is a great way to support this channel. I love you all. I'll see you soon.